I'm trying to give us a sharp way to think about the power of images and objects, how they are almost these agent-filled presences in the practice of religion.
Religion, at least modern voices tell us, is concerned with lofty and metaphysical things and shuns the material world. But then why are there so many impressive objects in the living practice of Islam? Richard McGregor heads the Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. In a book called Islam and the Devotional Object, he explores these objects of devotion and why they matter. One of the main objects that you talked about in your book was the Mahmal.
The Mahmal served a pivotal function in Hajj ritual for 700 years. Not only do we not hear much about it, we hear nothing about it today.
People feel very strong, they have very intense reactions to shrines and to relics. I think at some point you talked about them being feelings of like love and death.
We can talk about cosmologies and abstractions and theology and contrast that to the lived experience, right, of a religious tradition. But what's going on in that lived tradition? How are the biggest concerns of a human being engaged, being addressed?
Why does all this matter? Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. This episode is called Seeing Religion, Islam and the Devotional Object. Stories of pilgrimage and parading objects, of relics and banners, of idols and iconoclasts, destroyers of images and idols, all of them have formed part of the religious lives of Muslims across various geographies and time periods. Now, you describe these objects of devotion as machines of religion. What do you mean by that?
With that term, I'm trying to give us a sharp way to think about the power of images and objects, how they are almost these agent-filled presences in the practice of religion.
So by incorporating these objects of devotion, these machines of religion, into our understanding of Islam, we can move away from those analyses that overstate that role of ideas and concepts in the history of Islamic practice. Why do you think that's important?
This book was an experiment that is trying to shift our approach to the study of Islam, moving from our received approach, one that began with big ideas, big concepts, imagine theology, cosmology, and then subsequently searched for historical examples to confirm these big abstractions. That was the typical approach to the study of religion. And this book is turning the tables, really, beginning with objects, beginning with images, and following out what they unlock for us, and use that as our starting point for the history of religion.
One of the main objects that you talked about in your book was the Mahmal. In his description of the most captivating moments of Egyptian life, the 19th century historian Abdurrahman al-Jabarti wrote, "Felicitous Egypt has no rival for her three sources of delight: the Sultan's processions, the flooding of the Nile, and the rightly guided Mahmal moving by day." So these rituals were ways of reassuring the community that things were in order. So politically, via public processions, conveying the message that continuity at the top of the social hierarchy was being assured. Then, cosmologically, when the sovereign would open the dams, guaranteeing the agricultural cycle and thus the survival of Egypt for another year. And religiously, too, embodied in this rightly guided Mahmal. Now, this is something we don't hear about at all today, but it was an integral part of Muslim worship for centuries. What was it?
The Mahmal was a unique object in Islamic history, although it served a pivotal function in Hajj ritual. Hajj being, of course, one of the pillars of Islamic practice and identity. The Mahmal was an essential component to that practice in Egypt and elsewhere for 700 years. Not only do we not hear much about it, we hear nothing about it today. Just to remind us, it was a central, prominent part of the Hajj for 700 years, as I say, in Egypt, but Syria, and elsewhere.
Describe it for us.
The Mahmal was a palanquin, but a litter. Another Arabic term for it is hawdaj. That is to say, it is a tent-like structure made of fabric over a wooden frame that would ride on the back of a camel. Before 1250, before its use as a central part of the Hajj ritual, Mahmals were well known and even known in pre-Islamic Arabia and Middle East as simply conveyances, typically for the wealthy, we can imagine, right? But for example, a woman of wealth and standing in the Middle East would often travel around, especially on special occasions, in a covered in an elaborate palanquin. So this as a visual cue, right, in the landscape is well established, long established, and well known. The Mahmal as a religious object, 1250, the Mahmal comes onto the ritual scene in Cairo and remains a mystery to us historically. We do not have any historical record of the invention or the introduction of the Mahmal as a Hajj object.
So it's basically an empty decorated box, which is carried on two poles by bearers. Is that right? With a tent.
Yes, that's the structure, and it would ride on the back of a camel, and it could be, and of course it could be moved around and had to be moved around. You take it off the camel, and you put it up on the camel. Once the Mahmal became this central object in Hajj culture, the Mahmal was also paraded. The Mahmal was also set up to ritually receive interactions from pilgrims and visitors on the various stages of the Hajj. The Mahmal would be taken off and placed and would sit to receive the visits. It would be honored by pilgrims, by other grandees at various points. And the Mahmal would also be transported and sit on its own at Mecca, near the Kaaba, and then also in Medina in relation to visits of the Prophet's grave.
So these Mahmals were sent from various capitals, including Baghdad, Damascus, and then in the Ottoman period, also from Istanbul. They were also sent from Yemen and Aleppo. Regardless of of all these other places, the Egyptian Mahmal sort of aggressively asserted its pride of place over all the competitors. Why was that, or how was that?
Of course, politics and power were at play. And you brought up the rivalries between Mahmals. So who had the right to send the Mahmal? Whose Mahmal would take precedence? Would it be a Syrian? Would it be a Yemeni? Would it be the Egyptian? And typically it was the Egyptian, but this could be contested. And so the Mahmal could become a, let's say, proxy for wider diplomatic struggles or political tensions of the region of the period. And all of those sensibilities, the political, the devotional, the religious, right, the diplomatic, are inscribed on that object. And we just need to take time to look deeply and carefully at that object. And we will be telling those stories in all their complexity.
So the Mahmal from Egypt accompanied the Kiswah. Is this right? The cloth covering the Kaaba.
Correct.
So today the cloth is made in Saudi Arabia. But until last century, the Kiswah would be made in Egypt and it would be taken to Mecca. It was mainly made in Egypt?
Yes. The majority of Mahmals were made in Cairo at great expense, and we know that there were workshops devoted specifically to constructing kiswas, right, which are renewed every year, and the mahmals could be reused. So a mahmal might go a number of times on the Hajj to Mecca and subsequently to Medina, and then return to Cairo or the Yemen, right, or Damascus. They wouldn't last many years, the harsh elements, but also sometimes the inscriptions needed to be changed on the mahmals, depending on politics. So perhaps a new sultan has come, or perhaps a new khedive has been named in Cairo under the Ottomans. That would mean that those mahmals would need to be remade. But yes, generally the kiswa covering and the mahmal would go together for the most part from Cairo, and Cairo partly because of its long tradition of weaving and this khilas, these elaborate robes that were important in diplomacy and sort of elite culture. Egypt had long been the place where the highest quality robes with the most intricate inscriptions were made. So Egypt was particularly prepared to produce these many mahmals and even more kiswas.
So in Cairo, the mahmal and the kiswa were usually paraded 3 times a year. So before the departure of the Hajj caravan, and then when the pilgrims returned, and then also mid-Rajab, which is the 7th month of the Islamic calendar.
There are a number of hadith about the month of Rajab, including one recalling Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, saying, Rajab is the month of Allah, Shaban is my month, and Ramadan is the month of my ummah. Rajab is the month that Ali ibn Abi Talib was born, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, the first Shia Imam, and the final of the 4 caliphs who led the community after the Prophet's death. Miraj, the Prophet's ascent to heaven, also takes place during this month.
This procession was basically a major part of city life. And the way you describe it, and let's go into that a bit more, was that it was very carnivalesque. We're told of these great crowds. There's theatrics going on. They're huge processions.
The parading of the mahmal and the kiswa covering is a fascinating chapter in the history of Islamic ritual. It was very clearly understood to be part of this sort of religious social networking and almost advertising, getting people excited about the Hajj. And if we could just imagine, just try to project back, imagine, 14th century Cairo, and, through the streets comes this sort of 4-meter tall, spectacularly decorated, dramatically colorful object, surrounded by people perhaps beating drums, pronouncing prayers, right, in groups, clapping, and people crying, people rubbing their handkerchiefs for barakah, people rubbing their babies against the Mahmal, all right, to produce all of this scene, right, around this object, or this object being the catalyst, right, for a dramatic intervention into day-to-day life, to say, hooray for us, hooray for Cairo, hooray for the Hajj, join us, recommit, let us stoke your enthusiasm and your devotion to Prophet Muhammad, your devotion to the Hajj, your devotion to our religious identity and culture.
Can you paint us a picture of what these looked like?
They were very emotive and emotional and dramatic, but they were carefully managed, in particular around who was involved with them officially. So, of course, the Sultan. The Sultan would be directly involved in Mahmal parades, and then, of course, around him, everyone would be very careful. Who are his favorites? Who's in with the Sultan? Who's not? But then also generals, units of the army, mercenaries, right? And then we followed by ulama from Al Azhar, of course, right? The most prominent institution in the Islamic world of Islamic learning. So we have a sort of platoon of, we could say, of university professors who march along, celebrating the event, followed quite early on by Sufi orders. So the orders of Muslim mystics, right, which were formalized and institutionalized from the 12th century onwards. That is to say, only the Sufi orders that would be tolerated by the Sultan or would be under the Sultan's protection, etc. The Mahmal and the Kiswah were, of course, always accompanied by a very significant military escort. You can imagine it's already a treacherous, it's already a dangerous journey. But if you're going with these very, very valuable and symbolically very important objects, yes, they must be secured. So in the medieval and pre-modern period, we would have significant military escorts. Once we come up into the late 18th century and certainly the 19th century, there were alternatives to the land routes. Once the railroads were established and once steamships were available, we know that the Mahmal and Kiswah were typically transported by train and by ship, and the Mahmal went on elaborate multi-stop journeys across the delta to be processed at every city and town that it stopped, to be recognized and honored by local officials, and to have popular sentiments and religiosity stoked by its presence.
So how did people react to them?
The Kiswah is obviously a highly charged object. Kiswas were produced every year and sent onto the Kaaba. There was no predetermined design for Kiswa dresses for the Kaaba. So we have accounts from travelers of white kiswas, of red kiswas. It just seems dramatic to imagine a red kiswa, beautifully inscribed, apparently, as the historical records tell us. So the kiswa we see today is we think of it as invariably in this color and this design. Historically, that's not the case. There's all kinds of diversity was possible. The kiswa was made every year, and the Kaaba is dressed with it. And the kiswa has an afterlife after it has served, covering the Kaaba, where the kiswa is taken apart and circulates subsequently, typically as gifts. You'd have the Sultan of Egypt, who would have pieces of the previous year's dressing and would ceremoniously bestow it upon important favorite figures, religious figures. And it means that for us in our material history, we have several of these kiswa fragments survive because they're, of course, these precious objects loaded with barakah.
So the Mahmal would accompany the Kiswah, which would cover the Kaaba. Can we explain what the Kaaba is so that people understand the importance of the pilgrimage to it and its centrality in Islam?
Sure. So the Kaaba, being this almost cubic construction, that's the etymology. The Kaaba, which was pre-Islamic, right? For the Islamic sources are fairly rich in describing the pre-Islamic life of the Kaaba, and the early Islamic sources, the Sirah literature, for example, also talks about other Kaabas of the time, in the time of Muhammad, which were a few were destroyed according to Muhammad's orders, and others where historically we're not sure what happened to them. But Kaaba shrines were a well-established form of practice in this part of Arabia. Right. So the Kaaba is empty, except for has a couple of pillars in it in its modern construction. But in the earliest Islamic history, the Kaaba also served as a sort of a storehouse for precious objects that were sent typically in tribute to the newly established Muslim power. We know this again from Islamic sources, as far as I know. The Kaaba at various points in its history, so in its medieval and pre-modern history in particular, the Kaaba contained various markers within it. At times had plaques placed, carved plaques that were placed either on the walls, we know of at times, and at times on the floor. We know of some of these some of these nails, and they were these typically silver but inscribed nails or spikes. There was one, we have record travelers report one being at the head of the Prophet's tomb in Mecca, and we have accounts of various of these little spikes being anchored inside the Kaaba. We have at least one mention of a plank from Noah's Ark that preserved as a relic and sort of devotionally placed within the Kaaba. And I'm sure experts in that early literature could come up with more of the accoutrement for the inside of the Kaaba, which was otherwise an empty building, which received its dress once a year, even from pre-Islamic times.
Right. So that's one constant, that it's had fabric coverings throughout its history. So what is this symbolism of dressing the Kaaba like it's human?
You're right. The Kiswah, yes, literally dress. Literally, it's the Kaaba's dress. And the Kaaba is a feminine noun, and in various places in subsequent Islamic literature, typically devotional and Sufi mystical literature, the Kaaba appears with this feminine agency, and she is active and a dramatic player, perhaps poetically or hagiographically. Most famously, perhaps, in the hagiography of Rabia al-Adawiyya, where the Kaaba comes out to meet. Rabia is trying to make the Hajj from Baghdad and through the desert, and she's really not going to make it, and her donkey dies, and eventually the Kaaba comes out to halfway to meet her, and she says, "No, I want to see your Lord. I want to see your boss, not you." But people like Ibn Arabi talks at great length. It has visions and these various kind of sensual encounters with this feminine power and presence, which is the Kaaba. So the Kaaba has her dress. She had her dress, as we know from the earliest Islamic accounts, pre-Islamic. That is to say, this covering of sacred objects was a long established practice in Arabia. And the Kaaba received various colors of dresses, and the practice was to just every year to pile the next one on. So we even have early accounts of people wondering, oh, is this too much weight? Is this too much? Are we piling too much on her? So many garments, one on top of the other. But right, so the dress of the Kaaba, at some point, sending the Kiswah. We have various records from of course the hearts of various early empires all the way up into the medieval and modern empires. Right? So sending the dress, if you were the Sultan, if you were the Porte, if you were a king, you would want to project your power, and an easy dramatic way to do that was to send a dress for the Kaaba. And by the way, you would put your name on it. So we know certainly from a traveler literature, we have some accounts of the inscriptions in the 12th century of details. So this Kiswah was sent by so and so, Sultan so and so, in this and such a year. So the Kiswah could be literally, right, an advertisement, and literally a statement of power, of the projection of political power.
Let's talk a bit about impact. So the Mahmal made the Hajj local and accessible, and so the Hajj was something that has been believed to be incumbent upon every Muslim who has the means to make this journey, but not everyone could go on Hajj. It was expensive, it was dangerous, it took many months. So the Mahmal meant that everyone could participate in the Hajj. It kind of seems like it was a way of saying, well, you could do a pilgrimage wherever you are. Was that the intention of the rulers under whom the Mahmal kind of prospered?
Just to remind us, we have almost no literature in Islamic law about the Mahmal and its attendant rituals. We have the occasional historical account, especially around diplomacy and politics. That's when it often made the historical record. But we don't have a doctrinal intervention that created this practice in the middle of the 13th. We don't know why it appeared. So your question, I think the suggestion you're making is surely part of the answer. What did it do? What was its practical function in the phenomena of Muslim experience and religiosity? I think the Mahmal, in its dramatic, elaborate presence, right? It's strikingly, the scale of it, the color of it, the celebration of it, right? It's sort of disruptively dramatic, right? In daily life, was surely supporting and confirming the centrality and the experience, right, of the Hajj. You're someone perhaps who can never go on the Hajj. You can engage with the Hajj and its effervescence, right, and its power, the devotional religious experience, right, that's part of the Hajj. You, as a typical Cairene, and in other parts of the Islamic world, you can engage with that energy. You can engage, right, with that presence. This object here, going down our main street, and we're all cheering and praying and crying and clapping, and this is an object that has been on the Hajj, that has been near the Kaaba, that has gone and has been at the Prophet's tomb. So the Mahmal not only went, of course, to Mecca, but it would go to Medina and be taken off of its mount, and the fabric would be taken off of its wooden frame and would be folded up and would be taken right to the Prophet Muhammad's grave. It would literally do a ziyarah to the Prophet Muhammad, and then go back in reverse and be put back together and be remounted and then make its way all the way back to Cairo. So imagine that presence as the typical Cairene, maybe, who will never go on the Hajj. You're quite aware of all of that. And this, so here's this object with this presence and this power before you, within arm's length. Perhaps you're lucky enough to touch it, to touch that object of all things in the world. What could be a more intense link, right, to the heart of Islam and Islamic practice?
It also, so it kind of undid this distinction between distance and presence, but it also destabilizes other boundaries. For example, it was debated among jurists. It was venerated as a devotional object. And it also associated a sovereign with one of these central rites of Islamic tradition. So it kind of it allowed multiple sovereign rulers to associate themselves with Islam. Was that so? What were the implications of that?
As we mentioned, the Kiswah and the Mahmal both contain on them as objects in inscriptions both this religious devotional practice and expression, and a political and diplomatic expression. That division is a key part of the story of the end of the Mahmal as a devotional object. And in brief, both in Arabia and in Egypt in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, that discourse of a, let's say, more literalist, more conservative Islam became increasingly powerful and became increasingly central in Islamic public discourse. So the Wahhabi control of Arabia, and of course the Haramain, right, the sacred sites, put up more and more increasing resistance to Mahmal practice, the presence of this object as a part of the Hajj. And at the same time, in Cairo and elsewhere, but particularly Cairo, Muslim reformers became increasingly vocal about challenging the licitness in Islamic legal practice of the role of the Mahmal in the Hajj. So we have people like Muhammad Abdu, right, a modernist, a Muslim reformer figure. He's one who we can track through his public statements. Rashid Rida and others. There are debates that go on in the newspapers. There's all kinds of folks who contribute to this debate. But I would characterize it as one that became progressively resisting and at the end even hostile to Mahmal practices. That story ends with halting, the official halting of Mahmal parading, and just a few years later, halting of constructing and dispatching and sending Mahmals. Basically, the 1950s is when these challenges become more and more sharp and insistent, and these debates rage for decades, but it ends with the modern state acquiescing to this more conservative objections to sort of the purity of Islamic practices, which don't involve, which no longer, those jurists say, should no longer include Mahmal and its presence and its parading in the Hajj.
Inscriptions and banners. So inscriptions are another form of materiality. You know, you've got inscriptions on mosques, drinking fountains, buildings, on schools and hospitals.
When we start with things, as we mentioned, Mahmal, Kiswah, other Kiswah coverings, right? We see pretty clearly a denotive use of scripture that the way we would read, right, in public contexts, public texts, is not the way that you and I sit down and read something, right, on our tablet, right? We read these texts in sort of a glimpsing fashion. And in Arabic, where calligraphy is the typical form of public writing, public inscriptions, that kind of reading, that glimpsing reading, is the norm. In this book, in this project, looking at inscriptions took me pretty quickly to look at related objects, which were banners.
And so banners would be carried on parades, and it seems like everyone was doing parades. You had official parades, you had religious and civic associations doing parades, you had Sufis doing parades.
There were Sufi parades chanting dhikr. For example, Sufis at the famous Sufi hospice of Sayyida Suada in Cairo. Every Friday they would walk in procession to the Al-Hakim Mosque and engage in a ritual prayer and then walk back. People came to watch their procession, believing it was a blessed ritual. It was considered one of the most beautiful customs in all of Cairo. There were shared processions that crossed confessional boundaries.
For example, a contingent consisting of the Sultan, his viziers, judges, religious figures, and a group of Christian Copts bearing a copy of the Gospels welcomed the new Caliph al-Mustansir in 1261. Or, in late 14th century, the reinstatement of Sultan Barkuk was marked by a large parade of Sharifs, Sufi orders, Jews with their Torah, and the Christians with their New Testament. Jews and Christians also processed with candles. They also used to celebrate the other festivals together, such as the Molids or the Day of the Virgin Mary. There were Shia processions, for example Ashura. The history of this minority Shia parading, and even that of Shiism in Egypt more generally, remains to be written. Although Shia populations dwindled after the fall of the Fatimid regime, the Sufi hospices continued to house Shia, and thus some form of these Muharram observances persisted into the early 20th century. There were also protest processions. For example, the jurist and theologian Ibn Taymiyyah's denunciations of Sufism in the early 14th century led to the most prominent Sufi of the day, Ibn Ata Ala al-Iskandari, joined by the Sheikh of the Sayyid al-Sughada hospice, followed by some 500 Caireans, marching to the citadel in angry protest. Ibn Taymiyyah failed to win the Sultan's ear. Another example is when an Egyptian is killed by a Turkish soldier under the Ottomans, and Caireans rise up in protest and march to the head treasurer's house. Are there any particular parade we should talk about? Like, you've given examples of collective prayer, of parades for collective prayer, for example, when there was a plague, or to ask for rain.
Parading was a community practice, and that included non-Muslims. Under certain circumstances, Muslims would join with their Christian neighbors and their Jewish neighbors in processions. We know when the Mongols were about to attack Damascus, we know that there were processions around the perimeter of the city where Muslims, Christians, and Jews paraded together. Everyone brought their text with them, so they brought their holy books and processed with those holy books. And with all of the power that those objects could bring to the circumstance. And we know, yes, certainly in Cairo, we have many descriptions of communal practices around parading and scripture.
Can you tell us what relics are? The word in Arabic is athar, which is a trace or a sign or a vestige. So it can cover all these things. You've classed relics into different groups. Give us some examples of corporeal relics.
Relics relating directly to the body, right? And in Islamic practice, of course, starting with the Prophet Muhammad, and in particular, the Prophet's technical term is disjecta, but that is little parts of the body that were discarded. So hairs of the beard that were cut off, hair, but also finger pairings, fingernail cuttings. These in Hadith literature. So the earliest accounts we have of the interaction with Muhammad, as Muhammad's body and Muhammad's presence, include accounts of companions of the Prophet valuing and collecting relics from his body. It could include saliva. It could include water that had been used for ablutions. And like I said, these disjecta. We have versions of engagement with relic culture. The Prophet Muhammad, of course, being central, but it won't surprise us as we dig a bit further to see, certainly the Prophet's family, Fatima, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, and others directly in his line, and then more saintly figures as history moves on also become figures for relic engagement. So these are what I would call corporeal. The most famous shrine in Cairo is the Hussein shrine. And we have interesting contested narratives about where if that head is there or not. Ibn Taymiyyah was one who looked into it a bit, and he's pretty skeptical. We're never going to settle the issue on exactly where the head of Hussein is or where the body of Hussein is, and other important corporeal relics. These are clearly important objects historically. People celebrated them. People were moved by them.
You also have contact relics. For example, clothing, sandals, and then imprint relics. I think these things were sort of all over Mecca and all over Arabia, and so pilgrims were visiting all these different sites.
Yes, so yes, these versions of relics were widely spread, ubiquitous, really, historically speaking.
There's a really nice example that you've got about pilgrims visiting the house of Al-Arqam, where apparently the Prophet and his earliest followers met to practice this new faith. Another stop, which was the house of the Prophet's first wife, Khadija. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, right. So what emerged from this exploration, what emerged to my surprise, really, was a rich topography of relics anchored and produced in the very earliest period of Islamic history. These holy sites, these points marking events of sort of universal historical significance, the birth of Ali, the revelation to the Prophet, all kinds of events within the history of revelation, with the disclosure of the message of Islam. I came to realize that the Islamic tradition in the medieval period spoke directly about this wider sense of pilgrimage, which would include these sites. So, yes, of course, the Umrah, the Hajj, going to the Prophet's grave were key central practices. But going and engaging with this topography, anchored by what I'm calling relic practices, engaging with that topography was a common practice throughout Islamic history up into the modern period. The vast majority of that sacred topography and those relic sites are gone.
Where have they gone, or what's happened to them?
Just as one example, we can look at the house of Khadija, the Prophet's first wife. So we go through the medieval period and we come up into the modern, and it was apparently part of the idea of for expanding the Haram al-Sharif. And this house was filled with sand and was paved over and is now a parking lot.
So from your study, you established that relics grew particularly under the Fatimids, which is a Shia Ismaili dynasty that ruled from North Africa for 200 years. Can we describe a little bit what they did under Relics. So when the Imam al-Muiz enters Cairo, he's leaving Tunisia, coming into Cairo, founding Cairo. He came with the coffins of his ancestors, who were, well, the three caliphs, Al-Mahdi, Al-Qaim, and Al-Mansur, who were also the three imams. And then 2 generations later, we had Caliph al-Hakim, who went to Mecca or he sent someone to Mecca to open Jafar Sadiq's house and bring back things. So they were clearly very interested in keeping or in remembering.
Remembering in this way is a nice way to put it. Remembering in this wider in this wider sense of keeping in front of you, right? And keeping in front of people. If I'm the Fatimid Caliph, I want my ancestor, the Imams must stay in front of us, must stay in front of our eyes, even if not literally, symbolically, they're with us, they're around us. We are perhaps empowered and inspired by the guidance that the Imams bring to the world. I mean, this is a powerful idea at play. You bring up an interesting dimension, which we could call the sort of engineering aspect, maybe, of relics. And that's to say, relics and their utility in asserting, founding, positioning, claiming sacred space. If we want to build a shrine in our capital city, well, we're going to need an important figure, and we're going to need a tangible way to anchor that figure's presence. So the head of Hussein, for example, falls perfectly into that category.
There are stories that have circulated regarding al-Hakim's attempt to secure the bodies of Prophet Muhammad and the caliphs.
The historical record on it is pretty light, and we have 2 rather different versions of that story. So I don't think anyone is in a position to settle that debate, but maybe sort of half a step back, I think we could say, well, the Fatimids, that kind of thing would make a lot of sense, and the Mamluks and the Ottomans after them. But we know this is a ready practice.
Throughout its history, there has been opposition to the veneration of devotional objects, but then you have a lot of arguments also by people who accepted this kind of materiality. Can we talk about some of those arguments in defense, as it were, for devotional objects? We've got, for example, the polymath Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi talking about his reaction to pharaonic objects. People citing Aristotle, like Ibn Sina. Can you tell us a little bit about what they, how they justified, I suppose, the veneration and the respect for objects and materiality?
Well, the defenders would only get stronger, I think, as they dug back into the record. So when we go back, when we look at the Islamic accounts of the earliest Muslim community, we see Muhammad and others, right, using objects for example, the staff, Muhammad's staff, right, was used in this ritual way to sort of delineate his almost royal space. I mean, he's not a king, but you get the image, and that staff was subsequently passed down. And then the earliest community's recognition of the sacred sites around Mecca, that they were the stage for the practice and a model of the Prophet Muhammad. Where did those things happen? Where were those things said? Where right, were those events played out? They were played out in this topography, and that was preserved, and it was treated and understood to serve that purpose. In the earliest period of Islam, and then in the medieval and pre-modern, you could go back to those early positions to defend the material focused devotional practices. So yes, on the face of it, you could, right, there could be debates about images, debates about ornamentation, right? Debates about luxury goods, debates about certain ritual practices. These raged in the pre-modern and still rage today. But from this perspective of locating and understanding the history of those objects in those places and those embodied practices, there certainly is precedence, or there's material with which one side of those debates can certainly claim precedence.
And the end of these rites, they kind of marked a dramatic change in the way people practiced Islam. What do you think some of the implications have been?
Right now, there's an artist who has teamed up with one of the last remaining sort of elite producers of these inscribed textiles in Cairo. She is echoing and reclaiming and recovering this as a Cairene practice. I think some of these echoes and resonances are going to come back into lived Islamic experience in surprising ways.
Well, I think that's partly part of the reason that we're doing what we're doing. Trying to, well, what you've done in your research, and then, you know, what we're doing with this project, it's to just remind people that things haven't always been the way that they are today. So the Mahmals and the Kiswas of old and relics, presumably, are now in museums. And you're saying that this has basically neutralized them as devotional objects. And that's not to say that everything that people put in museums is neutralized. Why is that particularly the case when it comes to the Mahmal?
If you are in this middle of this modernist and Islamist debate, and there are the very different voices about licit practice and permissibility of these objects and these related practices, right, and these rituals, what do you do with a mahmal? A mahmal is not a quiet thing to get rid of in its size and its impact, and its memory in the collective psyche of the country, right? So what can you do with a mahmal? Well, what they did was put it into the museum. The museum was a place where this sacred object became, in a sense, secularized, became part of what the colonial powers had brought to the Middle East, right, which was the museum as a public institution, and therefore the museum as a self-statement of a people or a community or a state, right? The museum functioned as a sort of secular church in the sense of talking about an origin and presenting a self-identity. That's a rough presentation of the modern museum. But this colonial institution is brought to Egypt and becomes the place where the Mahmal is sent to be controlled and to be desacralized. And
what else did was it the French who set this up? The idea of the museum, and what did they actually do to the environment? What did they put in this museum?
Yeah, so the earliest history of museums in Cairo is a rather incremental history. So starting in the 19th century, there were various collections made of artifacts, and these were typically pharaonic artifacts. You can imagine, right? So from a European perspective, from a colonial perspective, they're not terribly interested in Coptic Christian culture, because that's sort of the wrong kind of Christian. It's the Holy Land, but the Copts are, from a colonial perspective, so Coptic Christianity isn't a primary concern. Islamic material certainly isn't a primary concern, but pharaonic material was. And the museum in Cairo, the first museum was actually Al Hakim Mosque. Go figure. Where there was a collection. We don't have a lot of details about that collection, but it was apparently a sort of rather haphazard display of pharaonic material, sort of, I guess, scattered around, right, the space. And there are various instantiations, but lead up to the establishment of the Museum of Islamic Art, which is downtown. I mean, it's very prominently. It's not centered on Tahrir Square like the Pharaonic Museum, but it's nevertheless in a prominent place, not far from downtown. That was one location, and another is the Ethnographic Museum, which is actually very near Tahrir Square, but is a very small institution, and it was attached to the Institut d'Égypte, which was a Orientalist, but became an Egyptian research society. The Ethnographic Museum is the Mahmal that they have sits there sort of uneasily. There's I think there's nothing else about the Hajj in that museum around it. It's just sort of, it feels like it's just plunked in. The new Museum of Egyptian Civilization, opened fully 2 or 3 years ago, has Pharaonic, Coptic, and Islamic, and has some related, has a Kiswah for the door of the Kaaba, an Ottoman. It's beautiful, and has a Mahmal. So it has been, let's say, I would say its most successful implanting as a museum object is this latest instantiation, which situates it fairly well as part of Hajj material culture.
Why does all this matter? Why did you write the book?
On the one hand, there's the wider methodological question, and it's something like, what are better ways to think about religion? What are more interesting and engaging ways to think about our religious traditions and the traditions of others? And I think this approach opened up new ground. It really reoriented and opened up things in a new way for me as a historian of religion and a historian of Islam. The second outcome of this book was this sense of finding ways to recover practices, recover contexts, cultures that aren't available to us as modern people walking around the world today.
I think there's also a third reason, and you make that point in your epilogue when you cite Ibn Arabi about how the intellectual and the conceptual is only part of the solution. It's only part of what it means to be human. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Certainly, when we are thinking about big questions, when we think about why am I here, or what's the meaning of life, when we think about God and the universe, when we think about bigger, but community, where are we headed? What are we doing here together? We engage with big ideas, with big proposals, big arguments at the same time and in parallel, not in contrast, is our sense of what we used to call aesthetic engagement. That is to say, the power of our senses, of our engaged senses in the world around us as it presents itself, and these our artistic expressions around us are also part of that picture. They are not they are not in tension, I would say, but they are surely interwoven. For us as scholars, we've not done a great job in finding these synthetic, integrated approaches to human experience. But this kind of work, I hope, is making room for the wider approach to the more full range of human experience in all of its depth and diversity.
How did you become curious about this topic? Religion, or at least modern voices tell us, it's concerned with lofty and metaphysical things. Yet there's just so many objects in Islam, in the lived practice of it. So I suppose that's reason enough. How did you discover them?
My own training was in Islamic studies at university, and I will never forget traveling to the Middle East for the first time and walking into a shrine, an Islamic shrine in Tunis, and feeling a stunning disconnect, feeling quite uninformed and unprepared. Although I was supposedly an expert in Islamic religious practice, right away I came to realize that there was so much more going on here, that the path that I had been trained on as a scholar of Islamic thought was not going to tell me the whole story.
So you emotionally, you felt something. Is that what you're saying when you walked into the shrines?
Yes, I felt that what was going on in front of me was going to resist any reduction. It was certainly resisting the reduction that I was trained to bring to it through my discipline, my scholarly discipline. This was a challenge. This was puzzling and also extremely exciting.
This actually reminds me of one thing that we haven't touched on. This is, well, I mean, you did talk about it, but how people feel when they are in front of these relics, or we talked about it with the Mahmal, but we didn't. People feel very strong. They have very intense reactions to these to shrines and to relics. You know, people feel it when they go to the Kaaba. They feel completely moved. Anyone who goes to see it feels it's incredibly moving. But people also feel the same things, or have felt, when they come into contact with relics and shrines and things like that. So is there a way to describe these kinds of feelings? I think at some point you talked about them being feelings of like love and death.
We can talk about cosmologies and abstractions and theology, and contrast that to the lived experience, right, of a religious tradition. But what's going on in that lived tradition? How are the biggest concerns of a human being being engaged, being addressed? If we ask that question, then all of a sudden I'm not puzzled by why this, I don't know, woman, rubs her handkerchief on the shrine covering or something. Because to her, surely, this is a concern of cosmological significance. What could be more important than the life of her, I don't know, sick child and the powers that may or may not engage with her and fate, and I don't know, however it's structured, but the devotional impulse must be driven by those greatest human concerns for them to make any sense. For us as the scholar, as the outsider, or even we just think about our own. Right? Why am I so, or why is she so drawn to, or right? And I think we could only be if we make that as the framework, right, for those engagements.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in Nashville, Tennessee by Amir Hakim, Malik Nota, and Ibrahim Ismail. And here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Aleem Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Layla Sharif is our social media strategist, who's managing the Muslim Footprints social media accounts. And Alia Muhammad is supporting with promoting the series externally. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Dr. Nadia Ibu Jamal, who lectures on the history of Muslim societies, Ali Asani, who is the Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University, Arif Jamal, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Farid Panjwani, who is the Dean of the Institute for Educational Development at the Aga Khan University. Additional reviews were also provided by Dr. Alnur Danani, who specializes in the history of Islamic science, philosophy, and religious thought. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages, where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya, and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.